For most people, the First World War is associated with mud and the trenches and Flanders. It's about the image that we have on Blackadder or from reading the war poets. But there is a very different narrative of this conflict, how it influenced ordinary people's lives, how it was fought in the fields, factories and the kitchens of people across the country. For the last 4 years we've been exploring ways in which ordinary people's lives in Worcestershire and the surrounding counties have been shaped by this conflict.
At the outbreak of war, the army was confident that it was well prepared for caring for the wounded. 50,000 beds stood ready in its own hospitals. The Red Cross and a network of indomitable volunteers across the country were equally determined that they too would have a role to play in caring for the wounded in wartime. Within months, as the military hospitals became overwhelmed by the number of wounded men needing care, the military authorities had no option but to turn to the voluntary sector for assistance.
Thousands of recovering soldiers stayed across the West Midlands, where there were over 30 convalescence hospitals and homes. Men in distinctive blue and red uniforms, to indicate they were injured, not shirkers, gradually appeared and became a familiar sight in towns and villages. They became an intrinsic part of the home front in Worcestershire, where many of the residents helped to nurse them back to recovery.
Abbey Manor, near Evesham, stood ready to receive the wounded just days after fighting had begun, thanks to the efforts of its owner, Mrs. Florence Haynes Rudge.
A stalwart of the Primrose Society, Mrs. Haynes Rudge had extensive organisational experience gained through her involvement in numerous charitable activities. By 1913, the perceptive Mrs. Haynes Rudge had already begun to plan for the possible conflict. She had set up a voluntary auxiliary detachment of the Worcestershire branch of the Red Cross Society in Abbey Manor, and here she hosted first aid and nursing classes for the local men and women. On the 28th of July 1914, with her local band of volunteers, she started the conversion of Abbey Manor into a hospital. By the 10th of August, the first orders were given for furniture and equipment to be installed. The conservatory was turned into the hospital operating theatre, and by the 24th of September, the Abbey Manor Voluntary Auxiliary Hospital had 25 beds ready to receive patients, just days after fighting had begun. Although the hospital wouldn't receive any patients from the 1st Southern General Hospital, Birmingham, until the 24th of May 1915.
Other women were being encouraged to help the war effort. In a patronising tone, the Worcester Herald told them,
"Those who have not been trained as nurses would not be much good at the front, even if they were able to go. But there are few women who could not give efficient help in a sick room or a ward of a hospital, under the supervision of a good trained head."
By autumn, a stream of wounded from the battlefields of Belgium began to arrive at the military hospital in Stourbridge. The local paper reported
many of them in their varied and torn clothing, their improvised headgear, their halting gait, and many other evidences of devoted and self-sacrificing service. A trainload of wounded soldiers, probably the largest contingent of battle-broken men ever brought into the township, arrived at Stourbridge Town Station on Wednesday afternoon, en route for the military hospital at Wordsley. A crowd of hundreds of local residents raised hearty and sympathetic cheers as the heroes passed in motorcars.
The journey from the battlefields of France and Belgium to the convalescence hospitals of Worcestershire began at a CCS, a casualty clearing station, just behind the front lines. And then continued across the Channel to England. A Worcestershire soldier wrote,
"We had a most tedious journey here from the 112th CCS. We started at 7:30 a.m. and landed here about 8 p.m. It was a beautiful hospital train, GWR with French engine. Each carriage is only supposed to take 40 sitting cases, and we were 64. I am decked out in hospital blue, with a red tie, and can't say I feel much at home in it yet."
More than half the wounded reaching the base hospital were then sent to England for further care, rapidly increasing the demand for beds.
By 1915, many convalescence hospitals had opened in large houses or public buildings in Worcestershire. The Bishop of Worcester turned the college for training clergy at Hartlebury Castle into a hospital. Avonbank in Pershore, the Larches near Kidderminster and Batton Hall in Worcester became Downton Abbey-style convalescence hospitals. In many of them, titles or influential, and often rather formidable women took on the role of commandant and raised funds. For example, Lucy Baldwin, wife of Worcestershire MP and future Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, was commandant of Wilden Red Cross Hospital in Stourport-on-Severn. For many middle and upper class women, these hospitals offered scope to take on activities and responsibilities outside the private sphere of the home, although in many respects what they were doing was just an extension of their pre-war domestic roles. Their duties ranged from cleaning and polishing to changing dressings, applying fermentations and taking temperatures. However, in Worcestershire, middle-class women were liable to come into close physical contact with men and their bodies, in ways that they would not normally have done in the pre-war era. Vera Britton reminds us of this when she recollects her work as a voluntary aid detachment nurse.
Throughout my 2 decades of life, I had never looked upon the nude body of an adult male. I had never even seen the body of a boy child since nursery days. Short of actually going to bed with them, there was hardly an intimate service that I did not perform for one or another in the course of 4 years. And I still have reason to be thankful for the knowledge of masculine functioning which the care of them gave me.
The provision of a good diet, a calm atmosphere, sleep and nursing care, and sometimes massage and physiotherapy helped the men recover from the trauma of the battlefront. The gratitude of the patients is summed up in this comment. Private Spence of the 2nd Worcestershire Regiment wrote of his stay at Hartlebury Hospital.
I transferred from the Royal Warwicks into the above regiment to keep them at war strength and was wounded at Hitcherborg on the 18th of May 1915 whilst volunteering to fetch rations for our company. Arrived in England on the 21st of May, and after a week in Birmingham Hospital was sent to this comfortable convalescent hospital, and after a fortnight of enjoyment left on the 13th of June 1915. I am very grateful for the benefits I have received, and the highest praise I give to the Commandant's sister and nurses alike, and shall never finish giving my praises to them, as a friend in need is a friend indeed.
But the horrors of the battlefield were never far from the patients' minds. Victor Goodrich, a recovering veteran, wrote home,
"Whilst at Malvern, as we were settling down to our comfortable quarters, we also read in the papers that our regiment had suffered terrible disasters at Ogratina and Katia on the Sinai Desert. This occurred on Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April 1916. More than 100 comrades were killed in action. This put a heavy shadow on our life in Malvern, and most of us were anxious to go out again and avenge our old pals."
Providing entertainment for the men was also a really important part of the recovery process. For example, the men were taken out on outings and trips. The munitionettes from Blackpool Factory in Worcester took wounded soldiers on an outing down the river to Tewkesbury. Diversions for the men included sports, amateur dramatics and handicrafts. Patients at the infirmary in Worcester were provided with an embroidery class, and matches between local women's football or cricket teams and soldiers in Abbey Manor and other hospitals were a feature of the county's schedule. Public subscriptions paid for a full-size billiards table at Abbey Manor, which was highly valued and greatly used. And there was even an Abbey Manor orchestra, which regularly provided concerts and entertainment for the men. Some patients would never return to the front because of the severity of their injuries, and would transfer to rehabilitation centres where they could learn a new trade such as watchmaking and basket making. Many others were nursed back to fitness only to die on the battlefield. Some injured men took matters into their own hands and sought to ensure that they would not recover from their injuries. George Hewins from Stratford later recalled how, as he was due to go before the medical board, He deliberately
bent down to do up my shoes and split open my wound. I had to go before the board, show them my leg. There they sat, a load of old colonels. They fussed, and they ummed, and they ahed.
Day-to-day running of the hospitals was carefully ordered and controlled by commandants, such as Mrs. Rudge at Evesham Manor, who created a rule book, and patients were also expected to help with work, labour and tasks of the hospital when well enough.
Meals. Breakfast 8 a.m, dinner 12:30, tea 5 o'clock and supper 7:30 p.m. Going into town. All patients must return by tea time. Sundays. All patients able to walk must of a Sunday go to their places of worship in the charge of an officer of the house or an orderly and non-commissioned officer. There is no leave on Sunday mornings otherwise.
Visits were a highlight of life in the homes. At Abbey Manor, visitors were allowed on Friday and Sunday afternoons until 5. Relatives could come at any time between 2 and 6. Those that had come a significant distance were often provided with accommodation by the local community, who supported wives and mothers visiting their husbands and sons in the hospital. As the local newspaper reported,
"The ladies have been most energetic in fitting up the room in the basement comfortably and attractively. Rugs and carpets are placed on the floors, comfortable easy chairs are placed round small tables, vases of flowers are placed in the windows, a piano has been provided. The wants of the guests were very quickly satisfied by the army of ladies, and it was not long before the men were enjoying a smoke. Tobacco and cigarettes were being freely distributed."
Support for the wounded and the Red Cross was ubiquitous. £22 million was raised for the Red Cross during the war. Its mission touched the spirit of the era. Consequently, its annual Flag Day was called Our Day.
Abbey Manor was reliant upon ration money for the men, public support and the Rudge family funds. They did not receive any money from the British Red Cross Society. Many of the social events and activities at hospitals were also geared towards raising funds, with whist drives and garden fetes, for example. Many local people also made donations, whilst farmers gave food and produce.
The final year of the war significantly increased the pressure on convalescence hospitals. The German spring offensive and subsequent Allied counter-offensive resulted in large numbers of casualties. Hospitals were urged to increase the number of beds available.
Florence Haynes Rudge expanded her facility by taking on the tenancy of Chadbury House and converting it into an annex, adding a further 45 beds to the 100 the hospital already had. Abbey Manor held a large fundraising fete that summer to help fund their expansion and purchase a new ambulance to transport wounded soldiers from the station to the hospital, a task that had previously been undertaken by Mrs. Haynes Rudge and her daughter's cars.
Nationally, more than 1,600,000 men were wounded. Many of them owed their convalescence to thousands of ordinary people, largely women, who cared for them in hospitals throughout the country.
Following the signing of the armistice in 1918, the number of patients slowly decreased, and whilst other VAD hospitals in Worcestershire were soon demobilised, Abbey Manor Hospital continued to care for the wounded until it closed on the 22nd of May 1919. On the following Sunday evening, 25th of May, a Thanksgiving service was held in the saloon at Abbey Manor, which was conducted by the Vicar of Evesham and attended by a large number of staff and supporters of the hospital. The military hospitals could never have coped in caring for the wounded without the inspirational organisation and resolve of women such as Florence Haynes Rudge and her many volunteers. Indeed, the Red Cross today has acknowledged that no one could have anticipated just how important hospitals such as Abbey Manor would be, and the sheer number of servicemen that would help. In the New Year Honours List of 1919, Mrs. Haynes Rudge, the Commandant of Abbey Manor Hospital, received a CBE for her truly remarkable, generous, tenacious and invaluable contribution in providing convalescence for the wounded servicemen in the First World War.